So good afternoon. I'm Glenn Longabaugh. I'm filling in for Brian Young. I was going to tell you I was Brian Young, but you guys would know that really quickly because he doesn't have this much hair, but he's a lot more handsome. So anyway, but Brian is under the weather, and so I'm going to fill in. And we do have his presentation, and he had a lot to share with us, and it's really around weed resistance management, right? And the question is, are weeds winning? And do we have the right herbicides, or are the weeds just adopting to the way we're using these herbicides, right? These are the two questions that Brian was posing to the audience, right? And so I'm going to tell you a story about a population of water hemp, right? So Amaranthus is the common group. When we think about the pigweed species, we talk about amaranth. And I can tell you that there's a population in Illinois that is pretty concerning, right? And this is an area in Illinois where they actually have a fair amount of seed production. And because of that seed production, it's kind of a monoculture. So Mike, what they've done is for years they have used a lot of HPPDs, a lot of atrazine, and a lot of S-metolachlor, right? So products like Lexar would be a staple in that part of the world in seed production. And consequently, what they've got is they have this population that has a lot of herbicide resistance in a single group of plants, right? So I'm going to tell you about some of the things they're resistant to. So they are resistant to 2,4-D, which is a group 4 herbicide. It's a growth regulator. They are resistant to HPPDs, specifically mesotrione, right? There are other HPPDs. 2,4-D in soybeans, the product we use now is called Enlist. The HPPD, mesotrione, is called Callisto, right? But it's also an active ingredient in Lexar and Acuron, that sort of thing. They're also resistant to PS2 inhibitors. PS2 inhibitors are those group 5 herbicides like atrazine, right? And so that's another resistance that they have. They have resistance to ALSs, right? And so those group 2 herbicides that we used to use a lot of, that would include things like Classic and First Rate and Pursuit, right? Those are all group 2 herbicides. And then lastly, I wouldn't say lastly, but one of the other things it's resistant to are the PPOs, right? And these protoporphyrin oxidase inhibitors have for some time been under fire for being, having resistance in these water hemp populations. But before, we were talking primarily about the diphenyl ethers and those products that we use post-emerge, right? So we were thinking, we had a lot of resistance to Blazer, to Avalanche, to Cobra, to Reflex and Flexstar and Marvel, right? Those are the diphenyl ethers that we can use post. Turns out this population potentially has more resistance to the ones that we use pre-emerge, right? Things like safofenicil or Sharpen, sulfentrazone like the Authority brands, and even flumioxazin, which is an active ingredient in Valor. You have to excuse me, there's a lot of brands here to keep track of. When we think about herbicide resistance, right, we got the group 2s and the PPOs, right, are target site resistance, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And we don't really have a good resistance ratio, but you need to know that this is probably a pretty big number. And let me describe what a resistance ratio is, right? So when you see a resistance ratio on 2,4-D, and the folks with Brevant shirts, they're like, oh my gosh, you're telling me that it takes a 9.5x rate to control weeds? No, that is not what a resistance ratio is. Here's how you come up with a resistance ratio. Typically, they take a susceptible population of a particular species, and they do a rate ladder to see how small a dose will actually either kill or give some quantifiable damage to that plant, right? A quantifiable amount of epinasty. And they record that amount. And then they take a resistant population and treat it with a increasing amount of active ingredient until they get the same level of control, and that's what they use for the top number. The ratio is where they take the larger number from the resistant population. Let's say that is 5 grams, right? We'll change the units on it. We'll say that's 5 grams, and let's say in the susceptible, Mike, it only took a half a gram, 0.5 grams, right? If we divide 5 by 0.5, what would be the ratio? Anybody? It would be 10, right? And so when you see a ratio of 16x, it doesn't mean that it took 16 times the labeled rate. It just means that it takes 16 times more in this case, it takes 16 times more Callisto to kill that population than it took to kill a susceptible population. Does that make sense? So that's part of the number. The second part of this is around the mechanism, or whether it's target site or non-target site. Non-target site is pretty easily explained, right? We think of that as being like metabolic resistance. In other words, the plant takes up the chemistry, Larry, and it maybe shows some of the effects, right? It's not that it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't show the symptomology of the chemistry, but the plant has the ability to metabolize, right? Degrade that chemistry before it predisposes the plant, right? If it can destroy that chemistry before it has a chance to kill it, then we would say that it degraded it or metabolized it, right? When we talk about target site resistance, that's a little harder to explain, right? When you think about chemistries like ALS, right? ALS's, we build resistance to ALS chemistries very quick, right? That's the EMEs, the classics, the first rates, right? Those group 2 herbicides, what they do is they actually block the production of 3 key amino acids. In fact, it's one of 3, right? It's either leucine, isoleucine, or valine. And if you think about how they are put together, right, there's typically a site, and we can describe it as like hand in glove. In here, I've drawn a cartoon where a normal site would be square. The herbicide would bond in that site and keep it from assembling the amino acid, one of these 3 key amino acids. And so what the plant would potentially do is, if it mutated, it could change that site to where it could still build the protein, or not the protein, but the amino acid, but it would not necessarily be affected by the chemistry. The other way that you get target site resistance is sometimes the plant will just make more targets, right? It will just produce more of these sites to actually tie up the herbicide. And so this is about the simplest way I can put it, but let's go back to the slides. There is a couple of caveats here. One, we talked about atrazine being having a resistance ratio of 250. You need to know that MetroBusiness, which is what we use on soybeans in this particular population, still has a fair amount of utility. In other words, when you use, I think the amount is what? 5.6, 5.3 ounces, and that's a pretty good dose, but we use often 5.3 ounces of MetroBusiness. We can actually hold 67%. We can keep the control at 67% for 42 days. And 42 days is a fairly long period of time, right? I mean, that's more than a month. That's about a month and a half. And at 10.6 ounces, we can keep 88% control for 42 days after treatment. Now, that would be excellent, but there's a caveat with using 10.6 ounces of MetroBusiness. What would that be? Tim, what's the problem with using that rate of MetroBusiness? The guys back at Superior Ag, man, they're looking out for you because they immediately started doing this, right? No, it's not about the money, right? It probably would be expensive, Pat, but it's not the money, right? The problem is that you would get a lot of phyto, right? If you use 10 ounces of MetroBusiness, you're probably going to roast some soybeans. And so this is probably not a viable rate. Something else you need to know about this population is that when you use glyphosate and glufosinate with 2,4-D, then that resistance pretty much goes away, right? So we would consider it not resistant when we use those two. But you know what? All of this bad news about this population is still not that damning. Let me tell you what the real problem with this population is. The real problem is there's another mode of action that you guys use all the time for herbicide resistance management, and that is the group 15s, right? The most popular residual herbicide that we use in this part of the world are group 15s, and those are the very long chain fatty acid inhibitors, right? That would be things like Outlook, Warrant, Zidua, and Dual, right? this population has a strong resistance to that group of chemistries. So when we talk about non-encapsulated acetochlor, we're talking about, when we're talking about non-encapsulated acetochlor, we're talking about warrant. When we talk about allochlor, that's not a chemistry we use on corn on soybeans any longer. That would be Lasso. You guys remember Lasso? And then peroxysulfone would be Zidua. At 28 days, we were already down somewhere between 56 and 75% control with these herbicides, right? With these group 15s. We had less than 27% control at 28 days with metolachlor, S-metolachlor, and dimethenamide, right? And so this is pretty scary. We use a lot of those chemistries here. Now, remember that at this latitude or in this locale, we use a lot of SMOC, right? Whether that's as Everprex, whether it's as Charger, whether that's as Dual, we use a lot of that, and it still has a fair amount of utility, right? It still works very, very well. It's probably not as good as Zidua, maybe a little better than Warrant. You know, there's a pecking order there, but this particular population has been exposed to a lot of SMOC. That's what you need to know. Any questions about that? All right. We talk about herbicide resistance management, right? Ray, when I talk about herbicide resistance management, there are some cornerstones, right? The cornerstones are this. You have to rotate when you can, because then you can use other effective modes of action. Multiple effective modes of action is absolutely key. And the third one that's absolutely a cornerstone is you have to overlap your residuals, right? If you do those things, right, don't raise a monoculture of soybeans, don't use the same, the same chemistry, or just use post chemistry, and you'll probably fare out of this a lot better. You know, here was an abstract that it's kind of wordy, but ultimately what it says is that they basically ran some models to see what kind of resistance you would expect using just alternating residual herbicides, right? And if you took, in this case, they used the way I understood this abstract is they used Treflan, which we don't use anymore, right? Trifluralin, we don't use it anymore because you had to work it in twice. We do use some Prowl, which is pendimethalin, and then they rotated that with another group 15. You know, that's a group 3. They rotated with a group 15. And what the model suggested is that just alternating that one side of action back and forth probably would lead to resistance in half the time as using multiple modes of action. So in other words, the takeaway is this. If you want to know how to control herbicide-resistant weeds, we need to use not just a 15 followed by a 15, right? We need to use, in that first pass, we probably need to use a 15, which is Outlook, Warrant, Zidua Dual. We need to pair that with a 14, something that has a lot of soil activity, whether that's flumioxazin, whether that's sulfentrazone, that might be fumepicin, right? Fumepicin doesn't have a lot of utility post-emerge, but it still has a lot of utility pre-emerge, right? We could even use some safofenicil. But I want to caution you, one of the things that we've done is we've moved to a lot of Zidua Pro, which has a dose of safofenicil in it, and it does a great job of burning down, but there's not a huge amount of residual in an ounce of Sharpen, right? And we can't really use a lot more Sharpen than just an ounce on soybeans, right? That is the labeled rate. So, more good news, right? So this is an example on the left of where we used XR nozzles, and we used Roundup, dicamba, Liberty, and AMS. And what you'll notice is absolute sudden death. And this is kind of the way I've always thought about it. If you guys asked me in years past, Glenn, do you think 2,4-D will control weeds as well as dicamba, I would have said no, there's no way. 2,4-D is just not as coarse. It's not as good on weeds as what dicamba is. What I would tell you is that is true when you treat them exactly the same. But you need to know that there are so many restrictions on dicamba that there's a lot more parity between those programs than what you think, right? So in other words, when you take Roundup, PowerMax, and XtendiMax, a low volatility formulation, and you add Liberty to it, and then you add On Target, which is a drift and deposition aid, and you put a volatility reduction agent, and you spray it, this is probably most important, you spray it with a TTI nozzle, you are going to lose some efficacy. You can see on the picture on the right, you didn't get nearly the control out of this application as you did this application, right? And so we actually had that back here in the back. We had a trial where we did a rate ladder, right? So we used by the way, you need to know that Liberty is not labeled to use with dicamba, right? But for experimental purposes, we took Extend and we took Enlist, and we put them out at a half rate on canola and flax. And that's because Bob really wouldn't appreciate us bringing a bunch of tall water hemp in here and dumping it out, right? So we took a half rate of Extend and Enlist, then we went to a full rate of Extend and Enlist, then we went to a full rate of Extend and Enlist with a half rate of Liberty, then we went to a full rate of Extend and Enlist with a full rate of Liberty, right? Enlist in the back, Extend in the front, right? Not mixing those two. Then we went to went to a full rate of Liberty with a half rate of either Enlist or Extend, then a full rate of Liberty and a half rate of Liberty. And I can tell you that I was actually shocked. The reason why we had this trial is because I know how farmers are, right? They often want to subvert the rate. I don't want to look at anyone individually because we all have that cheekbone, right? We all are looking for a bargain. And I thought it was probably highly unlikely that guys were going to put a pretty expensive Liberty application in with a fairly expensive Enlist application, right? I thought, boy, I think what's going to happen is they're going to try to cut that rate on one or the other. And as an agronomist, I probably better have some idea how this is going to fare. And so the results absolutely flabbergasted me, right? I'm often wrong, but I can tell you that's how you learn, right? You don't really learn when the results don't surprise you, then you probably didn't learn anything. And what I learned was that actually Liberty probably was the most important component of the two. And so what that begs is if Liberty has to be at the full rate, then probably the Enlist, you might as well be at a full rate because it's not the expensive component, right? It's the Liberty that's expensive. So, regardless of whether we had Liberty in or did not have Liberty in, I can tell you that this year was different because we actually, in the past, we've always put the right adjuvant package in when we sprayed dicamba, but we didn't always change nozzles. Oftentimes we still use flat fans. And this year we used TTIs, and even though that's probably the best nozzle for that particular chemistry, I can tell you that we did lose a lot of utility from where we've been in years past. You believe that, Mike?
Yes, I did want to ask about the fact that you don't have AMS in this side. Do you think that plays a role?
Oh no, that's huge. Absolutely. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. Again, it's the restrictions on dicamba, right, on extendamaxine and Ingenia that is actually why we didn't get the control. That's why this is not really a labeled application, right? You can't, the reason why they don't label Liberty to use with Extend is because you can't use AMS with Extend. You're exactly right, Mike. And so the adjuvant package of Extend is not compatible with Liberty. So that's why you're not going to see that combination. Does that mean that I prefer one over the other? Actually, they both have great utility. But if you're going to use Extend Flex, you cannot tank mix them, and that's probably not a very successful way to use it. How I would use it is I'd use my Extend or my Ingenia early, and I would follow that with a sequential application of Liberty, right? That's how I would use it. So here is the application strategies that Brian put forth. Obviously, this is Extend and Liberty are restricted up to R1. And in the case of 2,4-D, you can go up through R2, so it's got a little wider window. If we're making residuals, we probably need to make them prior to V5, right? Now that may be unrealistic for some of the folks in this group because we do plant a little earlier than some other folks, right? You think about when they plant it at the Indianapolis to Lafayette latitude, they plant typically the latter part of April, first part of May. Their soybeans are often not flowering until the summer solstice, where we often have soybeans here that flower by the 1st of June, first week in June, right? And so this may not be as applicable for us. But the beauty of making a post residual application before V5 is the goal is to get these residuals, they have soil activity, and the goal is to get them on the ground, right? For them to work and have soil activity, they have to make it to the ground, right? And of course, the way that Brian suggests is maybe try to rely on some of the residual activity of dicamba, use it earlier, and then follow that with glufosinate. And then, of course, if you're in list, you can use that considerably later. I can tell you that in this group, if we followed the restrictions on plant height, whether that's with group 15s or with these post applications, we probably wouldn't get a lot done, right? And I guess I would tell you that when it comes down to, we never want to encourage off-label applications, but if you're going to either not have a crop because of water hemp, then you're probably going to make that call. And I can tell you, we've looked at, there's always the chance that you could cause a failure, but that's your, we're never going to make that recommendation for you. That's something you're going to have to insist on. So what questions you guys have about herbicide applications, herbicide-resistant weeds? Right? If you're going to take one thing away, right, it's on that first application, we probably need to go to a 14, a 15, and a 5, right? A PPO that is pretty broad spectrum. We need to have a group 15 and use a full rate, right? It's oftentimes I can tell you, I don't know how to spank you guys, but I've gotten after you about this before. As growers, it's pretty common for us to go to our account rep and say, wow, man, that residual is pretty steep at 3 ounces, right? Or whatever the rate they tell you. And you encourage them to want to subvert the rate, right? And that's not to say that you don't get control with 2 1/4 ounces of residual liquid or some lower rate, but you don't get the same level of control. And this is how we often get to where we have herbicide resistance, right? Is using lower rates. So let's try to keep our rates up. Try not to shop so hard. I know I can tell you that a lot of our inputs are going to be higher next year, right? Nitrogen is going to be higher. Potassium is going to be crazy high because Mosaic just closed one of the, a month ago, lost their most productive mine in Saskatchewan from flooding, right? And yet the one thing, even though we know chemistry is going to go up, proportionally it will probably be less than any other, it will go up less than probably any of your other input costs. Is that fair, Mike? Yeah, so questions?
So what's their plan of attack on this small area of water hemp out there? Do they have any idea what they're going to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so you got Aaron Hager with University of Illinois. He's he's kind of the mastermind. This would be, this is his project, not Brian's. But it's of concern, and the whole Midwest is watching it, and I'm sure they're trying to isolate it best they can. I'm sure they practice, I'm sure they practice good hygiene when they go in and out of this area. That's something that we could do too, right? How many of you guys have really good control in the majority of the field, and yet the outside edge has got 30 inches or, 40 inches of water hemp, right? The temptation for Glenn Longabaugh, I'm not going to cast stones at you, but my temptation is always to take that divider and get out there and get every last bean, right? Because I want to win that Dadburn Superior Ag Yield contest. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to collect every one of those beans. But you know what else I'm collecting? I'm collecting that water hemp, I'm bringing it into the combine, and I'm shitting it all around the perimeter of that field, right? That's about the last thing in the world we really want. And then you're thinking, well, it stops there, though. I just contaminated the rest of that field. No, you take the head off, you run down the road, the machine shakes up and down, right? Because it's not smooth out on the road, is it, Craig? No. Yeah, you just loosened it all up, and as soon as you turn the separator on, you just contaminated the next field, right? And you guys know how quick it moves, right? Because many of you have seen this exponential explosion of water hemp, in just a relatively short period of time, right? You know, you kind of go through these stages. You know, first it's like you don't know, and then you go through denial, and then it's like, oh no, you know, when you finally figure it out, you've got this problem.